Hello everyone, today we talk about the traditional meaning of space. It may sound strange to think, say, a physical concept to be traditionally intended, but this is exactly the point of it all. Like our post-traditional understanding of space, conventionally speaking, not necessarily through mathematics or physics, because these actually show that things can be a bit more complicated than what generally we have sort of flattened our, just our perception, or at least our ability to perscrutate in a deeper sense the world around us, shows a much greater complexity and proper meaning within. At least, in fact, this sort of container that we came to think mostly space as in general. And indeed, that we make history of religion basing ourselves on sources. So my point is not to challenge any particular view, but just to provide with the information that we get from, in fact, the past cultures and civilizations that is two-sided, right, complementarily with what we know. And it's as you know, I've always been extremely vocal about the fact that I'm a great fan of science, so we can say. I mean, not just because, of course, science too as a word should be understood in a bit more complex way than just, memes on stars and planets on social media, into some sort of deeper approach to reality in the first place. But of course, when things get serious at an academic level, you can even see, of course, how many people's intentions, background, sort of takes are somehow rigged, right? Never think that actually feels like mathematics and physics are radically more ideologized than I can say by direct experience of both in, for example, in academia, especially the historical field. Technically, what should be apparently more political and sociological turns out to be the field where there is less radical, takes based on specific post-traditional political doctrines. Philologists, by experience, I know they're radically more politically ideologized. Literature students, philosophers, admittedly, these are, say, within the humanities. But there is, at least where I come from, where I objectively didn't see too much. There historically was, of course, a leftistic influence, obviously enough. Western Europe from the so-called contestation and so on. There is actually not a prevalence of this, right? The actual red faculties are the scientific ones. Maths, physics, chemistry in particular. But that happens to be a reason. It would be very interesting to investigate. But in a broader sense, I've never developed an idea that our, what you really study in school books regarding maths, physics, or chemistry was anything short of amazing, right? I've always liked this field. I have something for inorganic chemistry. My great grandfather was a famous professor in the field who worked also with the Curie couple. And aside from that, I have really no more evident inclination towards scientific, strictly meant scientific field. But my view, having also studied in a so-called scientific high school, and coupled especially with, in fact, how I studied history later, not just that, I studied also other things along the way, made me simply realize that there is nothing really in contrast between the respective subjects. Some people get to some of the same conclusions that turn out, in fact, to be scientifically very traditional, or at least matching with what tradition told us, and it's nothing surprising for me. And so I don't even see the opposition. And I simply highlight the same from my historical standpoint. Like a physicist does this in his own field, I do it from my own. And even this, as you know, I've never pursued a specifically recognizable, say, political ideology, right? What most of my takes are very unusual. Even within conservatism, it's not like it's a mixed bag, right? That is untypical for the conventional. What are entirely like what we call classical politics is mostly just like post-traditionally biased politological categorization. It's literally that it pertains to a dimension that I had also up to a certain point in my life never heard of, and that I came to learn just through, not even through these subjects, not even specifically through history of religions, but that you sort of develop the more you go on within the respective fields, and especially you see that there is something matching that sort of encompasses the entire knowledge. So this video is, again, an explanation of how essentially the post-traditional to the current world differs conventionally understanding from the traditional one regarding space. We'll talk about time as well. This is incredibly important because the way we think the world is literally, according to tradition, what the world becomes. And there is an overarching explanation of how even materiality occurred, how our sense of finite did at the same time, which, of course, today we'll not talk about this, but in a much more general sense is the idea that the heavenly vault cracked, right, with original sin, and literally the world as we know it formed. And it's not like we are sentenced to some penalty by some higher force, like in a strict sense. It's that our perception of reality is exactly just such, and more specifically a consequence of our persistent sin. In other words, if we were perfect, our entire sensorial experience would disappear. In other words, everything, this is very counterintuitive and also crazy for anyone who at least studies, this is actually so crazy in some currents of physics and math. Like, I will not digress in this also because I'm not an expert myself, but the idea that, of course, we share a world that has not some sort of given standard that cannot be altered, and that we're all into this, in reciprocally influencing one another to the point of sharing even this leveling experience of having literally created a patch not to that essentially demolishes ourselves along the way, makes us mortal, makes us finite, is nothing but the product of our rigged mind / spirit that is all one with, say, the actual flesh, but only because this would actually and functionally be only one imperfection was it properly reordered. This is just to make the very long story short as a general premise. Then this is, again, not specifically what we will discuss today. Everything goes in parallel also with time. There are lots of similarities regarding the non-regulatively abstract establishment of a chronological dimension. Equally, space takes on a dimension in itself that is only also approximately perceivable as such, because everything can literally go back just to one or to none, depending on how you could evaluate God, the truth, etc. This is, our spatial conventions themselves are a pure act of faith, right? Because in our world there is no proof whatsoever that a point, a line, or a surface exist. We don't even know technically what they are, because they entail the concept of infinite that automatically is the limit of our mathematical knowledge. And so we will see it better along the video, but the limit that we encounter even in accepting that space as such exists, and or that it is actually not just the perception of something even infinitely multidimensional, and however precisely meaningful in the way it manifests on the basis of divine power that is also by degree present in every manifestation, including ourselves, is really the key to the entire point. And definitely, in the post-traditional world, space is, as I was pointing out before, conceived normally just as a sort of container, right? There are no other words to actually describe better, because they would include the same spatial vocabulary. But you have this sort of vacuum that can be measured in some way, within which things are. And we sort of pretend that the space exists in some linear sense, or at least in the way we normally approach it because of our finite condition. There would be a lot to speak of also neurocognitively, that is to say, we don't have the palest idea of what conscience is, and so whether what we experience is actually, and what does real even mean, right? You know, I like the word real. I use it because conventionally this is what we have to deal with. That's why maths and physics are correct, because if we accept those physical manifestations of in the same way that brought us to define space, we are essentially describing through such subjects the world, and it does work. Our knowledge may be that limited, but we've made a great job to sort out at least a part of this, a degree of this, through scientific laws and theories. And so the thing goes on, and the more it goes on, it does seem that things are really way more complicated. But we also live essentially within this condition rather than dimension, to the point of fundamentally accepting, for the limits of our own fall, right? How, the degree of our capacity of acknowledgement and or of conceptualization of such dimensions. All right? Just think that the ancients, to some extent, believed that the earth had been created during the fall to avoid the souls falling even further down. This is some sort of later, already sort of more modernized, secularized, materialistic explanation for something that naturally is much more complex. And in fact, in the millennia, we find very interesting views of and literally, we will stress now the concept of vision, because the idea, especially that everything that again exists is essentially a product of our will and nothing else, right? There is no real external factor operating, if not dichotomically, in the immanent power that this manifestation entails, and we can relate ourselves to in consonance with the entire universe. That's also the great deal, but it's still something deeply stemming from what was originally again all one, common within itself. Perhaps the most important concept besides this fundamentally metaphysical issues lays within the aforementioned difference between the traditional conception of space and the post-traditional one. Because in the traditional one, because if in the post-traditional view was really counts, again, in the lower way we conventionalize this space, very down-to-earth ways, what happens within the space is apparently not important for space itself. Like, the focus is basically on it. Just banal example. Think about how much legitimately, and say, people reason about or think, but let's not be that generous, about for example, the infinity of the universe, how pop culturally ridden this thing is, how people fixate on it, while they actually have life, a big deal of stuff, and the unimaginable even happening literally next to them every single day, and just fixating literally on something that they can't even fathom, in the sense that it's like trying to solve a system of this infinite scale without even knowing. It's just like even resolving trigonometric problems, much more, let's say, than that, of course, in proportion, without knowing how to do fractions, right? It's one of those things, if you don't know, where do you even start to think about that, while you're actually invested every day into something else? There is a lot of this literal push towards alienation that actually involves our own world, even our capacity of action in space. Minimalism as the failure of, say, people who choose to be unsuccessful because they don't have much, because they don't actually do much in their lives. This fortestator paranoia towards any manifestation of power or wealth, for example. And even by a certain degree of still fortestator, because this doesn't differentiate between left and right, the sense that power would hopelessly be something corrupted, and so you shouldn't have anything to do with that, even though the imperial Catholic tradition says the opposite. You should be able to taint that, so that's the only way to salvation. Never mind. People read Tolkien, and Tolkien didn't understand anything about this, nor about providence or whatever. But it's the fourth estate or post-traditional myth. The traditional view on space actually essentially defines the latter through the same objects and movements, in a way that acquires, again, a universal, a metaphysical, metaspatial meaning. In other words, while the post-traditional view conceives space as uniform, but also essentially inconsistent, essentially conventional, right, and conventionally irrelevant, just setting possibility of coordinates, just abstractly, with each part of this space deemed equivalent to another. This, so not just equivalent, but in this sense uneventful, right? Not even trying to understand how the event impacts this. The traditional world gave essentially a different meaning and degree of power and divine manifestation for each infinitely small part of the universe. In other words, there is nothing like the same in the universe. And if you think about this, it's not like anybody ever physically denied this. We perfectly know that that there is no such thing like equality anywhere to be seen in the universe. But think about this. The post-traditional thought fixated literally on this abstract possibility, whereas the traditional focused essentially on the actual event taking place in this realm. The post-traditional view implies that the position of an object or the occurrence of an event at a specific point in space does not essentially bestow any unique characteristics upon that object or event, right? This came also through, as a view to be formed to very relatably close and understandable phenomena. Think about the Age of Enlightenment that had its actually positive traditional and negative anti-traditional aspects. It's not like, again, people somehow think that it's either the difference between Burke or the French philosophe, but no, right? There is something strictly traditional as metaphysical within what happened during the Enlightenment, like during any era telling the truth. But picking the negative side, think about the broader concept of magic, right? And the idea that this is essentially like for a subject for cuckoos of some degree, and that instead was strongly connected, when you look at the history of territories, of folklore, localities, etc., with the actual places, with actual sites and locations that were believed, each and every one, of course, through an archetypal lens, but in a always different fashion, being provided with some specific power, meaning, and especially being the product of something. Because space eventually is filled with something. This something is matter, not only. Remember that through traditional doctrine, everything can be divinely transfigured, and as such, even the difference between the living and the non-living, according to our conventional scientific standards, is not that clearly cut at all, right? Everything partakes that degree of a divine spark, including matter, right? And think what was connected to such beliefs. Naturally, there were other, say, of local, say, particularity. Some of you will probably trace a parallelism, and we talked about this in other videos as well, with, for example, the evangelization of Europe and the existence of pre-Christian cults that were fundamentally, if not obliterated, basically turned into something different and adulterated from the original meaning, etc. We went through this. We explained the difference between the imperial Catholic tradition that predates Christianity itself, that surely altered historically some of its elements, but more as a product of self, as a consequence of what had been going on in the world, and still addressing much more effectively what had practically remained just of paganistic, that was not at all, had nothing to do with the actual imperial Catholic tradition of pre-Christian times that ruled over those places. So never confuse the chthonic fortestator, sort of superstitious, dark, crawling dimension of the universe with pre-Christian, as an opposite to Christian beliefs, meaning literally that those same beliefs that Christianity was carrying were properly of Catholicism, as it was administered before that as well, in times where still the Apollonian leaders ruled, and this chthonic mass that was trying to sabotage the entire system from their, again, non-heavenly beliefs was actually about. We explained how paradoxically Christianity did not persecute at all with the same intensity. For example, in the evangelization of the Germans, it also largely happened by itself, from within themselves, the Vodanic cult, for example, as opposed to the paganistic one. The paganistic one were to be eradicated. It was notoriously, also during Roman times, a distraction of the saint. It was during the Celto-Germanic sort of control of the same areas. It was just the enemy to destroy for any manifestation of divine power, right? Or something, not merely to destroy, but to conquer and to transfigure, to partake this augmented level of power. This is exactly what the Augustan Golden Era had done. This is exactly like the most missed and macroscopically so, peace in the entire history of religion. Right? This, in fact, completely post-traditional belief that there was a paganistic, polytheistic world between Christianity. This is completely false. There was nothing of that kind. A pre-Christian religion dominating the world was the same Catholic one that dominated afterwards. Right? Identical. There was no such thing like polytheism. There was such thing like paganism that was, yes, idolizing different objects, but not in the sense that they were literally considering the fixed, atrophied multiplicity of empty idols. Even pagans, so the fourth estaters of what we improperly call the pagan world, actually believed in a force laying within, in fact, everything that existed, which is the correct Catholic traditional belief, and that, however, was countering the upper elements because of the same usual reasons: social envy, fear of powerful people who succeed, of standards, whatever. And that, in this sense, we're the more material ones, and that we have exchanged, mistaken for the relics of pre-Christian Catholicism, and then instead are, in fact, most persecuted and most abhorred throughout by anyone before and after Christianity throughout all history. In the, probably at least in Europe after the Indo-European conquest, but still before such beliefs existed even. So I will not talk about this, but it's important because when you look at the history of, say, local beliefs, you must always take into account that we're looking at a hybrid between the two things. And so it's not much the physical materiality that has the upper hand, it's quite the contrary. The reason why these places were relevant and giving, in fact, meaning to space itself in different ways was, if anything, the sedimentation of the same from events that had occurred and what was believed to be pneumatically, somatically present within the same, and always with a dual meaning, so as a sort of double-edged sword, but still not to confuse in the more chthonic aspects as the actual true belief. No, that belongs to the literal paganism. So the actual losers of the story, which is mostly the problem, inasmuch the post-traditional beliefs make of space, in this sense, just a material reality. It's think about the disproportionate emphasis on archaeology in every sort of pseudo-scientific explanation, whatever. Like, we know what kind of lows information has reached nowadays. But they have to inject into this idea that if something is materially proven in some ways, or it's just materially presented, that is supposed to be sort of more relevant than something that we can guess through, actually, for example, documentary sources. So without conspiracy theories or whatever. This is, again, in this videos, it's easy to digress because of the importance of such ideas, but there is no doubt that there is an incredibly overrated bias in favor of such. Here's the material proof of what, right? Even if you have that, where does that come from? What else do we actually know? Do you have an idea of what the context really was? Archaeology does not solve history, right? It just doesn't. We rely continuously on documentary sources, and when these are not present because of particularly underdeveloped realities and or times where this was not really there, actually you notice that those fields, mostly that should be largely speaking historical, turn ever more into something almost physical or mathematical, together with the same aforementioned political ideologism that accompany with incredibly vicious doctrinal clashes. For example, we don't, I say it as a medievalist, as you know, we don't do anything like this. We are kind people. We even if maybe we have ferocious competition to whatever, but we sort of respect other people's theories because there is a lot to provide, to work on. When things start lacking and people start essentially abstracting and doing so just for some inclinations rather than evidence, the thing gets way more vicious, and also the problem doesn't quite get solved in the first place. The reason why we have essentially traded the traditional vision of space, among other things, with the post-traditional one, is that what has really prevailed is the immediate, emotional, unthoughtful, and let's say speculative, but also say not thought out, not meditated relevance, that say impression of the average person that we have given a disproportionate importance to. Right? If we have bombarded people for generations telling them that they are essentially relevant, even if they're not relevant, that they are good and brave and beautiful, even if they actually aren't. We have emphasized that we are at the center of the world is all for us. We have essentially convinced the useful idiot to do certain things, tricking him into believing that essentially the importance that people have in potential has anything to do with what they eventually do in act, right? And so we have paid free checks to people who did absolutely nothing to deserve any of it. By the way, very often this is the thing that actually worries me the most in a scientific sense, actually betraying the same also recent and recently positive, good, correct advancements in physical and mathematical theories of space in this case, involving, for example, curved and multidimensional, non-homogeneous space, etc. They're actually beautiful, fascinating. They're actually the frontier of science in many ways, and that most people, in spite of, again, clicking like on memes about this space and, saying, oh, I'm so passionate about astronomy, you find the chick that behaves like that all the time, completely detached from actual scientific culture, education, and intelligence. In other words, traditional views are actually way more consistent with what we know scientifically than what most people now have come to realize. In other words, these are the actual pagans, scumbags of the situation, that they do not even realize that there is an overarching dimension that really does allow those who access it the capacity of wielding power, which they are absolutely hysterically phobic and paranoid about, because of course they feel, of course because sin is always on purpose. Like it's not by chance. There's no such thing like ignorance separated from evil. It's always there at the same time. And so they have to counter that at the same time because they feel their standards to be that threatened. And in fact, this view of conception of space is, it stems from incredibly simplistic or even infantilistic mathematical models, asking a person how to describe even these topics dialectically or logically should really do. And so actually remaining limited to the most vile, materialistic and deterministic and in fact superstitious dimension, right? People may understand, of course, mechanical things, I don't know, for practical purposes, but let's say the experiential contexts are not really enough in that sense to simply ponder about the whole picture. There's an incredibly limited way of reasoning theoretically, and actually an access to reason abstractly. I mean, it would be good if people had more, let's say, practical, manual, physical education, but it's not like the people who on average, live within that realm are also that particularly more performing as human beings than the others would all. There is also a more worrying, to an extent, but also subtler point. It is to say that those people who have some, even sometimes standard scientific education, tend to miss entirely. That is to say, the aforementioned traditional conception, that is the possibility of a complete disjunction or properly misconception of our own limited physical understanding with the explanations of the world as we know it. Meaning, what this really gets down to believing or not, having faith or not. Essentially, this is what I complain often about: is that, at least I was told, or I told myself rather, that the actual fair play of science stands in accepting that anything that we know can, in theory, be ruled out by some other evidence that we hadn't taken into consideration, for whichever reason, either because we hadn't discovered it yet or because we had literally made a mistake in ourselves. And we can all relate to the degree of mistake that our, say, human performance entails. In my life, I've met instead lots of people who met a lot of even scientists that really did not believe in God, were openly atheistic, but let's not digress on the philosophical implications of what they meant or whatever, that were actually nice people and that would never treat you in a negative way for believing. Actually, I've never had much of an engagement with them in these topics, nor I was conventionally presented as a believer or whatever, so actually you don't even know what I actually believe in after all these years. But then I've met also lots of people that sometimes are not even properly, and that may have to do something with that, scientists or people that have a remarkably high scientific education. I have mostly like a humanistic education, but I wouldn't be surprised to be, in a general sense, more sensible, forgive the wordplay, than, I don't know, maybe the average teacher of physics or maths that we have in schools, right? Because blame it on the educational system, on these people are on average and whatever. It's not, again, I have some of my followers that come exactly from that background. They do not reason like that. But the tend, and this is also present, of course, at the top of the academia, so it's not like it can happen to anyone, but the distribution is fascinating to observe sometimes sociologically, psychologically, that actually reason in a completely different way from this, I think, purest scientific acceptation of our condition. Is to say, if something has not been demonstrated, it's not that we, for now, shouldn't take it into that consideration, because objectively, if it's not demonstrated and we don't have any other particular evidence of the case, we can't sort of do without, and or it's such a fundamental point that we have to solve so much else before getting there. It's just the God thing. No, they reason in this term: if something is not demonstrated, it must and cannot exist by definition, and nobody can think that because, or hypothesize or theorize that, because they are evil, dangerous people that must be suppressed because they're spreading bigotry and ignorance and anti-scientific thinking. I will not, of course, define further this kind of attitude, but you all know what we're talking about. So the sense is the following, banally. To all those people who would speak of the physical world, describing it in its intensive fields, let's say, solely through matter, energy, gravity, even though we do not have a full understanding of what these things are. We do not even know what it means to understand. We do not even know, again, what the fundamentals of physics really are by spatial definition. Is there like even just maybe a suspect that there is something beyond this. That is, doesn't have to be the God, the creator, the anthropomorphic God. It's something that transcends this all, right? It's something extra physical or metaphysical that could actually connect with it profitably and, having a merit in its qualitative distinctions. This is, of course, a difficult question to pose, because that person will have been trained exactly just to say, this is how much we know. If we don't know beyond this, what are we even talking about? That's a very fair position for that matter. The problem is when we are denied, essentially, even in the profession, that something was believed in the past that, after all, seems to be incredibly coherent with most of what we already know, just in a limited fashion, regarding the universe. And that again gets treated as a sort of superstition or anti-science, or something that cannot fit with it in the first place. Bear in mind, I'm not, again, making the point here that adult people claiming to have seen angels are people to be really, that deserve really our trust and full comprehension and beliefs. They're mentally disturbed people, right? In the overwhelmingly majority of the time, or there are people who are simply lying. They're just doing it for other reasons. And yes, legitimately, we can't call BS on that. And don't let yourself be fooled by, okay, but we have to be reverent because maybe it's the thing we're missing that. The Catholic doctrine actually tells you, even if that was the case, how does that actually combine with your existence, right? Are you going to go there and determine in any way if there was an angel or not, when the actual evidence actually, it always suggests something different? In any case, don't you have anything better to do? Don't you have a life to save? And don't you have things to show others? Don't you have to work? Don't you have to fix problems? Right? This is, in a deep moral and scientific sense, the bigger question. And so we live in a heavily paganistic, subcultural reality in which the average person just superstitiously scared and vile and ignorant and frankly filthy individual. And we shouldn't ever give anything to this as a moral imperative, right? Because we do have health systems, and we should thank God for science, and we should thank science for God, in a sense, because these are fully complementary ideas, and they all suggest that we just have to roll up our sleeves and do something with our lives, rather than faking, acting, having this feministically abhorrent behavior that everybody seems to be so engaging nowadays with, Instagram and showing off, and like this incredibly, I don't even know how to qualify it in an insulting way, kind of can so call it life. So in tradition, and we see it even among some primitive savage cultures that sort of survived, did not necessarily actually tell us what we would like to know, because don't think that being in this sense underdeveloped has necessarily anything to do with being traditional. Never make this mistake. It's sort of the easiest one you can do. There are societies that manage to maintain a certain awareness, others that sort of degenerated, and it's not like we come from that spring necessarily and passive. We don't know how it was before. There are theories about this too, but that's exactly the field in which people start stabbing each other academically. And so I will not enter even there, because it's in fact not even important. It's just what we were saying before about finding out how things really work. And we know, however, from this past and this evidence, that space traditionally was perceived as lively in the very meaning of the word, and infused, in fact, with a variety of qualities and intensities just per se, right? To make the sort of more superstitious but a relatable or intelligible example, when you travel and you stop in front of a natural landmark and admire it and so on, just imagine that the way you see it today, which is, if you even think about it, just infused with that sense, it's just a piece of rock, or it's water. It's something like there's nothing really into it. It's empty. It's dead, right? It's this force, whatever it is, it comes from something else. It doesn't actually pertain to this kind of matter. Was believed at the time to be something completely different. Not just it was to a degree associated with some kind of living character, right? Like saying, I don't know, that mountain is like an old man, right? But it was truly perceived in that physical existence as bending the space, literally into that form, right? Meaning that there was a force within it. There was a uniqueness in it. It's something, I don't know, it always clicks with me in a way, but whenever I travel, I think that the very first thing you can notice, even when the weather, light, season changes, one place always maintains that uniqueness in perception. Like a hard, let's say, atheist would tell you, well, that's just made an atheist just for the sake of hardcore, I don't know, physicists in the material sense. It's just an expression. You feel like that because you have memories, because you, again, that there is some sort of recurrence in certain phenomena that you may experience there. Your body even keeps memory that. Yes, the question is, what is life? What is consciousness? How do I even think? What is that? We do not know, right? We know at best how part of that works mechanically. But essentially, whether all this force is how actually all this force is transmitted, how this effect actually occurs, is a very different story, right? You do not know why, I don't know, an underwater cave chills you, right? In the thinking. I can't personally think of anything scarier than getting in such place. That you would say it's merely instinct of survival, something that you're mechanically, materially programmed to experience. Are you sure? Are you sure that this is actually not just something else? That this is actually deriving from an intrinsic force. I call it force, but I don't mean it in a physical way. I mean, if anything, I mean it in both a physical and metaphysical way. That in fact we can experience, even through such fear and through such vision, for example. But another sensorial, of course, reception. This is, as I was saying before, just a matter of faith. You don't have to bite, you don't have to try to answer this. But you have to reflect on how frequently, like in ancient times, this was normal, like attributing a spirit essentially to the same matter, and how this was completely correct, doctrinally speaking, in tradition. In fact, the traditional understanding of space is often intertwined in the sources with the concept of vital ether. Have different cultures calling it differently, with different etymologies. For example, in Sanskrit, we have the term akasha that has a very interesting etymological root, right? It gets often mistranslated. I don't even know why. In Vedic Sanskrit, in fact, the term can be used as a masculine noun with a general meaning of open space or vacuity. Right? In classical Sanskrit, the noun takes on a neuter gender and can convey the idea of sky or atmosphere. right? This is the case in Manusmriti and the Satapta Brahmana texts. However, there is more to it, and the more correct Vedic understanding of the term is an ethereal fluid imagined to pervade the cosmos. Now, this in the ancient wisdom was understood to be the great. In fact, it's just like the Milky Way, right? The idea is that this waters of the universe are basically corresponding to the burning ones of the psyche, right? And so of the spirit that resonates with the universe. In fact, the root of Akasha is Kash, which originates from Proto-Indo-Aryan Kash and Proto-Indo-Aryan Kash, tracing further back to the Proto-Indo-European Kek, which means to see or to look. It's also related to the Proto-Slavic Kazati, meaning to show, and the ancient Hellenic Tekmar, which means to token fundamentally. But the sense of vision, like the eye of Ra, which is naturally a spiritual one deriving from wisdom, actually refers to the aforementioned explanation of reality. In other words, what we define as space is what we create by literally looking at it spiritually, meaning that this also is framed within the actual ocular, vision, but in the sense that there is an actual power in our projection of reality. In other words, what we think reality is. And of course, the entire traditional knowledge revolves around the fact that if you really think about old Christian martyrology, etc., that witnessing the divine consists in believing blindly in God, naturally through a wisdom that must be acquired, so having the full certainty of such fides towards the deity, and so altering just through vision the entire world, molding the world through our own eyes, right? This is the symbol of the eye of Ra. And so it's not surprised that Kash means to be as well, because essentially space is nothing but what, again, is the product of our will, even if it's an ill will, even if this is, again, the consequence of the cracking of the celestial vault. This is exactly what we decided to create. And that's why, for example, as I was saying before with the example of the underwater cave, actually that hyperctonic symbolism, as you understand it, we fear that. We don't fear the sky. We look at the sky and say, wow, I love it, right? We fear the chthonic elements. In other words, we create our own fear. If that fear did not exist, that cave would not exist, right? And you know that in this, like, vision itself is a material consequence of our incarnation, right? It's the idea that even for the fact that we see through our physical, literal eyes, we are essentially subject to be scared by ourselves in this monstrous nightmare that we created as the earth in its manifestation. Instead, then perfection that wouldn't but satisfy us eternally. Thus, you can argue that yes, there is an illusion actually in all this, but it's not really meant in a physical sense. It's not to say that since it's an illusion, the cave does not exist for real, because as long as we are able to think it, it's because we're sinning to an extent that to us this will actually not go away. This power will manifest as such, right? it's metaphysically an illusion, but physically it's real because we have fallen that much from the higher divine incorruptible nature into one of becoming that can in fact even kill us if we are stuck under that into that underwater cave, for example. So bringing ourselves to annihilation for simply not being good enough. You understand where I'm getting with this? It's literally how they really believed the entire thing. For example, the concept of nothing. Do you know where the word no or nothing or this denial comes from? Do you know why in every Indo-European language we have this? Because when ancient men went out in the night, they asked each other, "What do you see?" And the answer was nu. Nu in their language did not mean nothing. This is very important for the concept of space. Nu was a liquid that obscured vision. In other words, when you went out at night, it's the idea of, think about night being also humid and having this characterization. The darkness is not actually an empty space without light. It's actually a real substance. Darkness, right, manifests, and I see it. And that's why what do you see became no, I don't see. But it actually meant I see nu. I see this actual darkness, this actual fluid that prevented you from seeing true. And darkness is scary, and darkness is the product of our own limitation in that sense that should guide us regardless of this. It's like, again, when you're a child and you're scared of the darkness, what is there to be scared of, right? Not really of much, at least in, at home. It doesn't make any sense. And when you actually think even about how our vision works physically, bodily, with radiations that actually are perceived by us as some sort of, we are actually living some sort of darkness if we were to take the most sort of physicistic explanation. It's just that our receptors react to specific radiations that allow us to see this matter that receives part of energy in ways, again, it's complicated, but in practice, that's something I used, I remember, whenever, I still use today, not because I'm scared of the darkness, but instinctively, you're wired to that, and you say, imagine this is just like, everything can be light or darkness, it's irrelevant. And you start thinking like that, of course, you're completely surpassing any even feeling that this is some sort of, oh my god, now there's the monster that comes out of that. Because that's sin. That's just cowardice and nonsense. And this is exactly what tradition highlighted as well. Another famous term is the Proto-Oceanic word mana, which is believed to have originally denoted the powerful forces of nature, such as thunder and storm winds, which in the Pacific really, are something in the life of these people. And it's, of course, dumb to assume that this is disjuncted from supernatural power in the first place. Of course, this understanding of like supernatural forces being near the world and having to be dealt with through a logic is really universal. So we have a broader understanding of tradition seeing space filled at least with an elusive substance energy that is space itself, right? Filling everything, right? Existing more as an ethereal essence than a tangible matter, but not excluding it as such, because what we see again physically is still the manifestation of that, and resonating in this sense way more actually with the psychological than the physical. This is also incredibly important, as we said before. Imagine again the underwater cave and the fear that can instill you if you are there, right? The sense is that physically it's there, but traditionally wise, there is a spiritual force within it that is actually much bigger. It's the same one that makes you feel the way you do, right? You can't even maybe touch the surface. You can at least be in the water, but you're scared anyway. And the reason why you are is this power that actually exists within it and that makes you mindful of it and that you just resonate with. This is truly metaphysical, or at least this is metaphysical in the sense that it's extra physical in the still limited physical understanding that we have. And so space itself is this all permeating ether, right? It's part of the universe, if you want. There are debates naturally about what happens at the edge of the universe and what was there before. There are great theories and discussions, except also at that point, as you know, some of the greatest scientists, some of whom are actually very interesting to listen to, etc., as you know, have radically different ideas of what it is, or at least they also acknowledge that it can be many different things. But however, everyone leans towards an idea rather than another, and that I personally think extremely interesting and very attracting towards science, right? And not just something used to, I don't know, shut people who say, I don't know, no, what you say is just, it's nonsense, it's invented, it's made up, it's fairy tales or whatever. We're talking about literally the same thing, right? And our difficulties in understanding things also through our sense, which is exactly, it's not, you see that there is a physics that awaits for us for being discovered. We invented physics in order to understand the world. So it's still us, right? It's not like you know the answer because you go by, of course, everybody should go by physics, but physics tells you only that much. And we perfectly know that there is much more beyond. Just as an elementary physical, scientific knowledge. In tradition, the aforementioned vital ether, because it does have a degree of divine power within it, is frequently imagined as light, distributed unevenly across different areas, leading each location to possess its own distinct attributes and to tap it into the inherent powers that reside there. Now, why is this imagined as light if, let's say, reality takes on also a chthonic character? Well, because it's part of our perception. Of course, there is a dichotomy between light and darkness, right? Between the Apollonian and the Dionysian, the Uranian and the chthonic, etc. But the point is that everything that exists actually derives from God, right? While Gnostics will do everything as possible to make you buy into the notorious paganistic foretestator superstition that there are two powers in action, the traditional reality is that there is just one force in action and that it has broken down, and there is a way to get it back together for an individual as a collective benefit. So even the darkest of the abysses, in a physical sense, is actually endowed with part of that divine spark, right? So it can be monstrously dark, but it's still something more than nothingness, than true darkness, right? So it's light in itself. And so every monster, every villain, every negative evil force is actually redeemable. And the actual purpose of salvation is this, right? Or at least the actual purpose of transfiguring it is to save the world entirely by essentially fixing it. This also explains why these objects have actual power within themselves. They have an actual amount of energy, for example, in a strictly physical sense. But there is more, as we've seen, and more importantly, this force actually encompasses everything. That is to say, everything mutually interferes with everything, right? So every action is there to be definitive in reality, but it also have this transcendental capacity of fixing damage, right? And we will talk about how this happens in another video, because of course it's metaphysically very interesting, but that's how much you can get. We can get, yes, something from the physical realm as well, and essentially pointing at some liminal directions, but that's exactly where we don't know what happens. And in any case, we do not fully know what happens really. And so whether, for example, there is a possibility to create energy that's like out of nothing, and how does this happen? And this is the great issue, and what do you do with that energy? What does it stem from, right? That's the entire deal of the situation. Consequently, space itself is not the container, but it's the actual content. Hence, space itself, so imagine this space that we think often as to a box, literally crumbles. There is none of it. It's just a purely conventional illusion. It's what it's within it that matters, literally. And so space, exactly because it's characterized in this way, it owns, right, in every place of it, a fate, an intensity, a mysterious individuality. In other words, every single place is meant to be for what it is, even in its constant change. And of course, in a super physical way, like in a metaphysical way, in the sense that it say what it is now was meant to be, but then what has to be is yet to be decided, even though everything is part of a necessary development, because everything does happen only in the essential way it must happen. You can't explain how life decides to act, but acting. Or there would be a way to know, but only in tradition, when this is absolutely transcending this fallen world, right, and putting it back together. St. Paul said that in God we are, and we live and we move, right? This is particularly correct, right? God, the divine, the sacred, the numinous, is constantly manifesting in this way. And it's very important to associate these terms, because we do not know technically what God is, right? At least in its ultimate essence. But everything that traditionally was intended as divine or sacred or numinous was attributed for very specific reason this character, or at least it was recognized in it. This modification captures what traditionally provided meaning to humanity. Because, for example, right, in the way it's administered, can also mold what we intend as space in a way like, I don't know, the Roman pomerium, right? There is a sacredness that occurs because an action properly etches, molds the world, the earth. And remember what we said before about this space, that is something that actually emerges out of the sheer will to power of a divine force, right? So the hero Romulus, for example, in that context, renders himself the city sacred. It's not the right, it's what it's vehicled through it by the numinous force that actually delivers that sacrality to the space. Just imagine this, and now all of a sudden what we intend by place, essentially, as space by contemporary convention. It's so abstract, impersonal, and at the end of the day, useless as an understanding of space, isn't it? Right? So while it would be impossible to explore all the traditional perceptions of space as much as their implication, we can talk about different aspects. For example, the magical and the symbolical one. Symbolically, it's obvious that ancient spatial concepts consistently laid the groundwork for the most unique representations of metaphysics. For example, heavens and earth, right? Heights and depths, as we were saying before, like they correspond to archetypal opposites. This is true also for spatial coordinates. For example, the vertical and horizontal axis, the right and left orientations. We made a video about the way of the left hand, and there, for example, the way, say, the importance of the Dionysian in divine transfiguration, as well as you need to take an eccentric path to know essentially how to maintain the same straight way, and why. Otherwise, it would essentially just sclerotize right into it. It's possible to succeed without that, but it can't. It never can happen. First of all, just even against your own rational will, without those forces, because any success comes from that. But it's more difficult if there is not just a balanced dose of it. A prominent example of such symbolism is the cross. We'll talk at some point about the metaphysical centrality of Rome in the cosmos. Who renounces to Rome renounces to God, and there's no way to God but through Rome. There appears to be a relationship between the two-dimensional cross and the four cardinal directions at the same time, as well as between the three-dimensional cross and a conceptual framework that includes the additional dimensions of up and down, for example. Think about the Futhark runes, Algids, and Tivas, for example. That's quite telling. Nonetheless, this does not validate, importantly enough, any naturalistic, if you want, geo-astronomical interpretations of ancient symbols. This is what paganistic superstition was about, right? The fact that a symbol evokes something does not mean that the symbol materially is what you should simply idolize per se. It's the living within it that you do, right? And that's why some people, as we explained, there's always a living part in every matter, right? But this must not distract you from the beyond. What the symbol is just the, say, the meaning of, and that plays somewhere else, if anything, because if there is a material object, it means that still reality has not been transfigured. And so you are essentially using that maybe as an auxilium, but if you essentially start depending on it, thinking that it's going to solve the problem for you, well, then you are actually falling to idolatry. And there is a very big difference between veneration and adoration. As we will see when we'll talk about the traditional meaning of time, there is some similar issue regarding the astral components of calendars, right? For example, the existence of the cross in the natural world suggests that that genuine symbolism is not a human invention. So instead it is an intrinsic aspect of nature itself. So in simpler terms, nature in its entirety is a representation of transcendent realities. So realities that do not belong to this natural world as we intend, to this physical world. They belong to a metaphysical one. Remember the doctrine of the two natures, right? This world is by itself, if let, say, to its own instinct, to perish. There is a capacity, in spite of the constant exponential weakening, of inverting the trend. That comes by will, and it entails the achievement of the higher nature. The doctrine of the true natures is the same one you see in Christ, by the way, so it's literally the same thing. In contrast, when we explore the mystical domain, the magical, if we want, we discover that throughout all sort of ancient civilizations, cultures, each geographical direction was linked to particular influences, often personified by various entities and spirits. So in other words, it was believed that within those physical places, these forces were at play. This, for example, was served at least as a foundation for key elements of augury and geomancy. We talked about the augurus slightly in that video about on the moral superiority of Roman civilization. These practices had a particular development in Far East Asia, which had, especially in China, some sort of greater, let's say, alignment of the political, this metaphysical forces with the political symbology of the great empire, everything laying under the king. In Europe we had this, but in connection to a way more effervescent and ever-changing nature of, say, the people that would be at that point in charge, and still stimulating, in fact, the understanding of the complexity of the world. That definitely is something that intricated to discern, to untangle, because this natural world is the product of that. It's product of a role of some sort that was formed against the order of things, rather than the other way around. But it's in this sense, in the different direction. That's why space is so fantastic in this regard, that you can trace the way back. And so all this, starting from its more miserable aspect to its actually superior one, points towards the absolute, points towards the truth. For example, the alignment of cathedrals in Europe was diligently maintained until the Middle Ages, consistently adhering to the principles of analogies, essentially sacred orientations within rituals and the design of the same temples. As you know, cathedrals were largely built not through Vitruvius, but through Saint Augustine's De Musica, as to stress the metaphysical symbolism of the pure light that especially the Gothic cathedral had to represent. We'll talk more about this because there is a very precise concept there of the height of the orientations, and there's an incredible set of symbolisms, which, by the way, all articulated in an incredibly precise way. That is really how these people thought to get power from heaven through. Right? The pyramids, as you know, in all their in their complexity, suggest that there was something more than merely like, I don't know, stones put on one another. There was some capacity to channel, for example, the force of thunder through gold that is excellent in that conduction, for example, and God knows what they were really doing. We'll perhaps talk about it some other occasion. In any case, these principles that are at work and can be seen literally in the same places in which we live, except we have forgotten that, because this is the exact problem. Like, I don't know, if you tour a city like Rome, do you think that the way it was built, like, it doesn't hold within this metaphysical symbology? Or again, just a Gothic cathedral doesn't contain this, just to be deciphered rather than simply admired. We do not understand what kind of treasures we have really so close in space, as a matter of fact. It's incredibly fascinating that to think that a point in space would have this catalytic capacity of drawing power from the divine, the immanent divinity of the universe, for us to be just accessing that in that form. It's that mind-blowing when you realize, because that's literally how they would do it, and nobody tells you. They just give you a materialistic explanation of how it was built, say, more or less, but the entire proportions, the entire meaning, the same orientations, the numerology behind it, it was literally what they cared about the most, and nobody told you, because they didn't want you to think of yourself in civilization as somebody that had that potential within you, because it's you who want this in the first place. This principle facilitated the connection of both human experiences in the tangible world with the cosmic and the unseen, the one that you must not think. It cannot even exist. It probably must be erased from the awareness of. So traditionally, just as one moment in time wasn't considered equal to another, when it came, for example, to performing actions, which you see reflected metaphysically, but also physically, they thought that this was the meeting point, that there was a reflection of this entire order, right? Particularly in rituals, right? It can be inferred that no single point equal in space, area, or location in traditional sense could be viewed as equivalent to another. And especially there would be some places that would hold that greater significance, not random places, but places like literally the urbs. So people today fixate with the paganistic dimension of this, so the subculture, the most vile one. Right? For example, say, I don't know, certain underground locations or caves were appropriate to particular rites, while some mountain summits were reserved for different ones. Here, it's at a much broader level. Pagans, in the sense of, again, also pre-Christian non-Catholics, fixated with this stuff. Normally, underdeveloped cultures did. Those who did not, in fact, wield power. There is much more to this, right? Historically, this is true for sacred geography. It's not arbitrary. The entire cosmos was understood in these terms. The entire Earth, these stars, it was all understood in this organic movement that still reflected an harmony, an impulse that had occurred through a divine origin. Remember, you can't go back from everything to the source to understand this. So the world as such is the gateway to God itself. It's a huge symbol that must be deciphered as such. It's not the tiny, petty things, right? This is why great empires dealt with this, whereas also the smaller communities did, but of course with much less also resistant effort. This reflects the physical manifestations of metaphysical principles. This concept is encapsulated in the theory of holy lands and cities, which are traditional centers of spiritual significance on Earth, as well as spaces that have been consecrated to enhance the effectiveness of every action aimed at the transcending. And this depends, again, not on a merely physical action, but on how much of that divine force was vehiculated through the ritual into the actual place, was injected into it. That's why there is a transcendental and transfiguring and redeeming power that can be wielded by those who can afford divine grace. Traditionally, the locations selected for temple foundations and many urban developments were far from arbitrary or merely practical, for that matter. And the way they were established was essentially dictated by specific rituals and adhered to distinctive principles of rhythm and analogy. The wealth of evidence available demonstrates that the environments used for traditional rites differ fundamentally from contemporary conceptions of space. And these traditional spaces, in fact, transcended the physical. That was the entire point. They imbued themselves with vibrancy, destiny, and an almost magnetic quality, so that nothing is really even just a coincidence. Nothing can be read just in a superficial way, or is random. And that's essentially said from a physical point of view, where you have really thought Epicureanly nature to be really all about, oh, it's so random. There's nothing to it. It just happened to be this way, and we have just to follow it. This is not just disregarding the fact, because most people that oppose the same view think, I know there's all an order, it's all perfect, it's like, a clock, it's all, no, it's messed up. The word is messed up. There's nothing positive about naturality as we intended, right? This is a hippie sort of Greenpeace-like Gnostic heresy of the 1970s, the 1960s. It has nothing to do with the imperial Catholic tradition. Nature is a big monster that you have to tame and transfigure in order to bring it back to its absolute perfection that it once had. Right? In such environments, so like the sacred places, every gesture held meaning. Its drawn symbol, spoken word, and performed action carries a sense of this inevitability and timelessness. It's as if you were remolding it back. You weren't waiting for things to change, for season to pass, to the earth to spin. You must act, right, to transform them into a kind of mandate for the unseen forces at play. A mandate that you have to be able to collect and actualize through your own virtue and consonance with divine standard. To heal this world that has been entrusted to you in this very sense. Moreover, in the context of the ritual, one should not presume that there is simply an amplified form of the general understanding of space, traditionally. Taking this into account, it's important to explore the myths that many today believe ancient cultures created regarding various elements and features of the natural world, right? And in this, you rather see contemporarily a tension between super-realism and humanism, right? The idea that essentially, yeah, you're in the world and that there's a greater force in the universe, man. You just look at the sky. No. That means to be a passive slob that has completely severed any connection with the divinity and is basically hypostasizing the the separation between the two as the gap widens dramatically, right? That's just a disgustingly spiritualistic. It's not spiritual. Most of these people are actually paradoxically some of the most materialistic ones, because if you separate God so far from you, you're also going to be that awfully materialistic and sort of abandoning yourself from sensualism and this sort of I have to connect with the vibe, to this great work of art of Mother Nature. Mother Nature wants to swallow you, wants to devour you, to spit you, or to digest you. To what I don't say what. Nature wants to kill you. I don't know if you noticed that, right? If you stay out there, you die, right? And you see, this is the feministic mythology that has been introduced. That, this is the materialistic, feministic, communistic system of the Great Mother that the Indo-Europeans crush also for you to behave as an actual man and to tame the chthonic forces, to be able to elevate ourselves to heaven. Together with all of them, transfigure into the beautiful glory, winged glory. And yet this is essentially the reality in which we mostly, right? I've seen people like, I've been raised a Christian, but no, that's bad. Now I actually believe in another religion. Now I believe in nature, in Mother Nature that comforts me and soothes me. This is how civilizations collapse, right? This is how, that these people, the only positive thing about that is that, these are the first people to shipwreck into nothingness. Just like the ones who say, I don't work from 9 to 5. Okay, good luck with you, to you. But as if, it's not that there aren't options, but the question is, it's not like everybody can have that option. At least, unless you are someone who's able to provide with enough force to change a bit of things. In the meanwhile, which is definitely not what the average person should flatter themselves into thinking of being, unless they actually do it, which is not the case macroscopically. And so what are we even talking about? So the understanding of space, we'll talk more about nature and how it's completely misunderstood. And there are some interesting aspects of, in fact, how you should definitely expose yourself, especially in the contemplative life in that is needed for action as well, to this monstruosity that nature is, because only through that you can fully appreciate what it is. And this is not just about space, about the physicality of it, of the dimension. It is something you can experiment by yourself, even just by depriving yourself of some commodities and truly experiencing what goes beyond, remember, what you see as an imperfection which stems from your sin, and that you are the literal responsible for. So traditional doctrine stressed that with adequate wisdom and knowledge, you can transcend this. You can go as far as literally transcending physicality, or at least not the fuses per se, that is always divine, they are always intertwined, but passing it to another level, right? And so transcending this great catastrophe that we have created as the world. This is essentially it, right? And we will come back naturally on the topic prepotently, because it's through all these things that you can fully appreciate what, say, the extent by which is compatible with the reality that we know. Also, and especially, I would say, scientifically. Again, I'm not here, as I said at the beginning, to convince anyone, but merely to expose this knowledge was believed for millennia, and one may want to know why it was so uniformly believed in any culture. and how it came to disappear just in the last couple hundred years, or even just few generations, as a matter of fact. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.